Right, welcome to the Jesaja Berlin Day 2011. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Henrija Hardija of Wolfson College, Oxford, who was a close collaborator with Jesaja Berlin during Berlin's lifetime as the editor of his writings, and Dr. Hardija is largely responsible for shaping the corpus of Jesaja Berlin's work as we know it now. He has been a kind and generous supporter of our efforts here in Riga to remember and to celebrate Berlin in the city of his birth. He's been here for all three of the Jesaja Berlin lectures, and he's profited, I think, from these visits to look a little deeper into connections between Jesaja Berlin and the city of Riga, and that's the theme on which he's going to share with us now. Henry.
I would like to return the compliment to Robert and thank him for his kind words and say how grateful I am to be made so welcome in Riga year after year. Riga is very patient and friendly, and I much appreciate it. And I love being here. It's a wonderful place. I think of the proceedings today as a lemon meringue pie. The first layer, the top layer, is the session at 4 o'clock, chaired by Niels Musnieks, which is the meringue. It's light and it's airy and it's nice and crisp on top. The second layer, the plenary lecture, the keynote lecture by Ian Baruma, is the lemon section, which is colourful, very substantial, sweet but also sharp. And I begin by providing the pastry layer that is underneath these sections, which is thin and brown and doesn't taste of very much. I should explain before I start that there is a problem when one is giving a talk about indicating when one is speaking in one's own voice and when one is quoting. And there are different ways of getting around this problem. One is to imitate the voice of the speaker, which in this case is Jesaja Berlin, and although I do a passable Jesaja Berlin imitation, I am not going to attempt that on this occasion. Another is, which people in academic life often do, is to do this, which means I'm quoting. The third method, which I have adopted, is whenever I'm quoting something, I put up a slide containing the words, so then you will know that that's a quotation, even if it's not apparent from the context. My first three slides are explained by my principle, which I enunciated on the centenary day itself, which is called Hardija's Law. I will just repeat it for the benefit of anybody who was not here on that occasion. Murphy's Law says that if anything will go wrong, it will. Kelly's Law says Murphy was an optimist. And Hardija's Law says, in the case of in technology for speaking, slide projectors and PowerPoint slides, it's much, much worse. And indeed, on that occasion, I was vindicated because it didn't work properly to start with, although it worked splendidly in the end. But this is why I have a test. And so, let's hope it goes on. My ignorance of the history and sociology of Latvia is profound. Indeed, my ignorance of all history and sociology is profound. Nevertheless, in the course of my work as Jesaja Berlin's editor, I have come across some clues that help to answer a question that has often puzzled me and sometimes embarrassed me, and I think may have puzzled or perhaps worried some of you. And the question is this: Why did Jesaja Berlin, who was born in Riga and lived here until he was 6.5 years old, show little or no sense of Latvian identity? Why did Riga in particular, and Latvia more generally, apparently mean so little to him? My embarrassment at this question is a response to the generosity of Latvia's attitude to its unappreciative son. I don't need to tell this audience of all that has been done here to honor Berlin's memory, to celebrate him as a Latvian luminary. I am embarrassed because he seems not to return the compliment. But the more I look into it, the more my puzzlement has been replaced by a sense of surprise and, yes, embarrassment that the puzzlement should ever have existed in the first place. There are several reasons for my change of heart. I'm not sure what their relative importance is. You will be able to help me with this afterwards, I hope. I shall mention a few of them now in no particular order so that you can see what you think. First of all, Berlin did not enjoy the company of small children and used to say that they did not become human beings until they reached the age of 7. On the back of the book of Isaiah, a book about him published in his centenary year, there is a photograph of him looking down at a young boy squatting at his feet as if he were a beetle. As you see, there is no human engagement. Another photograph shows him outside his house in Italy with 2 older boys. You can perhaps just see the second one in the porch at the back. The one beside him is 8 years old, and perhaps we can sense a little more rapport here, at any rate on the boy's part, unless the smile is for the photographer, who is his mother. Berlin and the boy are setting out on a walk together. And here is Berlin with his 2 younger stepchildren, Philippe and Peter Halban, who have evidently reached the age of humanity. When Berlin was president of Wolfson College in Oxford, he made a strong personal request that children should not be allowed in the communal areas of the college, except at weekends when he would not be there. This request was reasonable enough in an academic institution, but it was also personally motivated. To be consistent, we must assume that he took the same view of his own case. He left Riga before he was 7, and so he was not a human being while he was here, and cannot be expected to have experienced any human sentiments during his sojourn in the city. This may sound exaggerated and ridiculous. Is the child in this photograph not a human being? But I'm not sure that he would have thought it so. At any rate, by the time he reached the age of 7, he was in Petrograd, ready to receive his first and deepest recorded human impression on seeing a Tsarist policeman being dragged to his death by a lynch mob during the February Revolution. Petrograd he remembered in detail. The Riga of his early years, he claimed, he remembered hardly at all, though a number of memories did survive. For example, he told a story of threatening to jump out of an upstairs window, which inspired a painting by one of his Oxford pupils. The house in the picture is imaginary. As you probably know, Berlin's father, Mendel, could afford to live in a large, broad street called Albertstrasse, Albertovskaya, in a large building with 2 sphinxes on either side on the 4th floor, containing about 12 rooms, a proper apartment in the smart part of Riga. This, like many of the quotations in my remarks, comes from his interviews with his biographer, Michael Ignatieff, which are recorded on tape. I've had some discussions with experts on the numbering of floors in Rigan houses, and I think the consensus is that the 4th floor in this house is the top floor. Although if you start with 1 at the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I make it the 5th floor. So I think the jury is out in this, unless anybody has any knowledge which can determine the issue. So, I mean, I've heard a story, for example, that the Rigan authorities are thinking of turning the relevant flat into a Berlin museum, but I wonder how they will decide which one to... I suppose the directories of the time will show, perhaps. We must find out. One for Andres. The Soros Foundation Research Department. Anyway, it's clear that Berlin did remember the house and the sphinxes. There are the sphinxes a bit closer to. He wrote later to a correspondent, "I was brought up in the most conventionally middle-class bourgeois fashion imaginable, in a hideous stone house in the very German city of Riga. In the holidays, they went to Jurmala. Every summer, one goes to the seaside in Riga, and one bathes. One rides a bicycle, still the case as we saw in Jurmala yesterday. But the ghetto Jews don't go there. The Jewish bourgeoisie does." I should pause to digress a moment here to examine the word ghetto, which Berlin uses frequently to refer to the area where the Jews lived. As he says himself later, you'll see it wasn't a real ghetto, he just means the area where the poorer Jews lived, and he generally uses it to refer to the Red Dvina district, not to the district south of the railway station. But of course, more properly, it's the southern area which became a Nazi ghetto, so one mustn't confuse the two uses, although he seems to use them indiscriminately, which is a bit confusing. Anyway, his memories of the seaside suggest that there are some more memories there in his mind, and perhaps subhumans can remember things after all. This photograph is taken from the Berlin family album, and it says on the back that it was taken in Dubulti in 1911. And it looks like a wedding, and I can recognize several of the people in the photograph as coming from Berlin's mother's family, the Volshonoks. But no one yet, despite obsessive researches by me and others, bullied by me, have been able to identify this building. So if anybody can tell me where it is or was, or tell me about somebody who can tell me where it is or was, I should be enormously grateful. Berlin did spend 4 months in Riga, which was then the capital of a newly independent Latvia, in 1920 to 1921, between the family's departure from the Soviet Union and their emigration to England. But this brief visit left little impression on him. He speaks of Riga at this time in very detached terms. Riga is a perfectly decent little provincial town, the capital of a small democratic republic containing relations of ours. I had no sense of Riga, none at all. It meant nothing to me. I haven't got a slide of this, but he also said in an interview with Beata Polanovska-Sigulska something which is similar. He said, "Riga used to be a perfectly nice little town. I last saw it in 1928. It was a republic, a little bourgeois democratic republic, provincial, not very interesting, nobody very distinguished as far as I know, but a perfectly decent place in which people could be free and happy. It was time that the Latvians had a state of their own." Anyway, in 1920-21, his family naturally didn't live in Albert Street again, but in a room at 86 Dorpat Street, now Terbatas Jēla, which was then the home of a man called Jesaja Berlins, or Berlin. So memories of his first home were not stirred in him by his house at this stage. Berlin remembers no nostalgia for Riga when he reached England, although his mother told him that he would come home from school in tears day after day. He believed that the tears would have been tears of frustration at not being able to speak English, as you can hear from his own mouth, if the clip in the next slide works, which I believe it does, contravening Hardy's rules. Here Berlin is talking to Michael Ignatieff in 1995 for a BBC documentary program which was screened after his death.
Many people who go through the experience of exile and expatriation experience tremendous sense of loss and disorientation. I mean, was that the case with you, coming to England?
No, in no degree. I realized that my life had changed. But Riga was already different from Petersburg, in that sense. I'm a little bourgeois republic. I got Hebrew lessons in Riga from very nice old gentlemen. That went on, didn't go on in England much after that. No, do you ask me another question? No, I did not get a sense of disorientation. My mother said I used to come home from school in tears for days. I have no recollection of that.
And
none.
tears, why?
Because I couldn't speak the language.
We now come to the next thing, and this is where I can't tell you anything you don't already know much better than me, so I'm going to express it in a way which makes sense to me, and I hope that you will correct me if I'm wrong. Although I may be okay because most of the information comes from Daunis Auers of the University of Latvia. Is he present? Yes, okay. Who was very kind and helpful, and as one says on these occasions, he is of course solely responsible for any errors in what I'm about to say. Well, as somebody said to me this morning when I said what question I was asking today, I said, why did Berlin not feel like a Latvian? The reply was, because he wasn't a Latvian. That's fair enough in a way, but it needs expanding. When he was a child, Latvia didn't exist as a separate nation state, but had been part of the Russian Empire for 200 years. Nor was Riga a capital city, therefore. Although Latvian national identity had started developing in the mid-19th century, and by the time of Berlin's birth was already taking shape around a common language and a common culture, largely based on peasant traditions such as the forthcoming Midsummer Eve festival, songs and dance, etc. Riga was far more cosmopolitan than the rest of the Latvian territories. For example, as you know, between 1901 and 1912, the mayor of Riga was an English flax merchant called George Armitstead. German was the language of higher education instruction, and Russian was also widely spoken. Latvian was not an elite language, and the concept of a Latvian nation was not widespread in the upper echelons of society. This is why the modern Latvian state had to undertake significant nation-building activities after the Declaration of Independence in 1918. Latvia's territory had previously been part of Livonia, but this was an administrative district shared with the Estonians that did little or nothing to shape regional identity. Rather, people living in the Latvian territories tended to identify with their villages or towns rather than with a wider Latvian community. In Riga, Latvians were just one of many ethnic groups that enjoyed a great deal of cultural autonomy. Moreover, Berlin's own family did not come from Riga. As he put it to his biographer, "My family doesn't come from Riga as far as the centuries are concerned." Most of the Jews who lived in Riga, he pointed out, come from Russia, and they moved for business reasons. Berlin's father, Mendel, was born not in Riga, but in Lublin. He moved to Vitebsk at the age of 4 and did not come to Riga until he was 15 or 16 in about 1900 to live with his great-uncle, who was also his adoptive grandfather, the Riga timber magnate Jesaja Berlins, because, so Mendel tells us, the school exams were thought to be easier in Riga. Mendel stayed in the city from then until he left with his family in 1915. Berlin's mother, Marie, however, that's her pass for the Riga Music Academy, was born in Riga in what Berlin calls the ghetto, and once again this means the Red Divina district. Berlin said her roots were in the ghetto. It wasn't a real ghetto, it was just where the poor Jews lived. Her roots were there, that's the world she understood, that's the world she liked, that's the world in terms of which she used to talk, described characters and personalities in it with great vividness and great humor. But her family too came from outside Latvia. She was Mendel's first cousin on her mother's side, and so she shared half her forebears with him. And her father's family, the Volshonoks, the ones who were in the photograph from Dubulti, I'm not so sure about, and perhaps someone here can tell me where they came from, but my guess is that they too were living outside Latvia not far back in time. Anyway, Marie lived here from the beginning and was married in this building in 1906. Berlin described the social hierarchy of Riga in his day as consisting principally of 6 levels. First, the so-called Baltic barons, fanatical German Tsarists who spoke Russian as well as German. Second, the rich German merchants who created the German opera and the German theatre. Third, the Scandinavian merchants and the poorer German merchants. Fourth, the richer Germanized Jews. Fifth, the poorer, pious, Yiddish-speaking Jews of the ghetto, the Red Divina district. And sixth and last, the Lets, the majority of the population. I'm not quite clear where he thought he belonged in this hierarchy, if anywhere, but I suppose it would have to be number 4 most nearly, although it doesn't really fit. Perhaps he was more of an outsider. Well, by this point I began to realize that it is not Baltic geography that determines the loyalties and affiliations of the inhabitants of Riga. There were several distinct cultural streams running through the city, and the ones in which Berlin found himself were Russian and Jewish, not Latvian. When he was asked about his identity later in life, he always said that he was a Russian Jew. An Anglophile, certainly, but not an Englishman, still less a Latvian. And Riga, he said, was not a Russian town. Russians did not feel at home in Riga. And he added, most of the Jews lived in the ghetto, and they were Hasidim. That meant that the center of their spiritual life was Lubavitch, a small town in western Russia where the saintly leaders had held court. Berlin's separation from the Latvian cultural stream can be vividly illustrated by his somewhat harsh remarks about it to his biographer. He told him that underneath the poor Jews came the vast bulk of the population of that country. They were Lets, they spoke Lettish, they were Helots, they didn't exist humanly, nobody had relations with them. The Germans despised them and oppressed them. They were serfs working for the Baltic barons. In town they were servants. They were very lower class. They spoke their own language, which nobody understood. One saw them in the streets. The tram conductors were, some shopkeepers were. One of them was his first nurse, Anna Porteus, who spoke German to him. So I now come to the last factor that I want to mention in answering my question, and this one was suggested by Berlin's stepson, Peter Halban, one of the boys in the earlier photograph, the elder of the two, in his interview for Ginz Gruber's film, Born in Riga. I hope you've all watched. All the members of Berlin's family who had not by then left Riga for whatever reason, and no doubt many friends and acquaintances too, were murdered there by the Nazis in 1941. Although Berlin rarely referred to this fact, the hypothesis is that he could not think of the city without a shudder for this reason. I don't know whether this is true, but it is not implausible. Berlin never visited Rumbola, the last resting place of his relatives. But when I go there, I think of them and of him and of this silent void in his family. Who can say what the 1941 dead might have been and done had they lived? In conclusion, though, let us not be too hard on Berlin. He had no wish to deny his origins in this city. When he was addressed by a new graduate student at Wolfson College in Oxford who did not know who he was, with these words, "My name is Stephen Grounds, and I come from Birmingham," Berlin replied, quick as a flash, "My name is Jesaja Berlin, and I come from Riga." And he did. Thank you.
Henry, let me thank you for a beautiful speech, brilliant, funny, enormously informative and educative. I have one question, and it's a tough one. Who is the child in the first picture?
Who is the child in the first picture?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Poor little 2-year-old.
The one on the ground.
Yes.
That is 18-month-old Christopher Utekin, who was the grandson of Jesaja Berlin's personal secretary, Patricia Utekin, a very, very English lady called Utekin because she married a Russian emigre called Sergei Utekin, who wrote a celebrated encyclopedia of Soviet Russia. And Christopher is now a man of 22 and is doing an MA in politics at Sussex University in the political philosophy of Jesaja Berlin.
So it didn't have a long-term effect.
So obviously that meeting was deeply influential. I'm very ready to answer questions about anything, whether or not it's connected with the talk. Yes. Wait.
My question relates to your last remarks about 1941 and the Holocaust here. I wonder, did Berlin, was he so anglicized? What was his allegiance? Did he maintain relations with his uncles, aunts, cousins in this part of the world, or did he not?
Yes, there are lots of, well, about direct relationships I'm not sure. There are a number of letters which survive from his relatives in Riga to the family in London, which you can see, and they always contain inquiries about Shire, as they all called him, and I'm assuming that in the letters that were written back, he would have written a little piece at the bottom, because I have got some of his letters to relations in other parts of the world, and he tended to write a PS after his parents had written, giving his news. So I'm assuming that that went on, and when he says he last came here in 1928, I'm sure that was a visit to his family here. So, yes, not closely or frequently, but yes, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Henry. I'm Andrew Soper, the British Ambassador. I have an answer rather than a question.
Good.
I visited this morning the building on Albert Street with Madam Vairavika Freiberger, former president of Latvia, and we were very generously invited in by the current inhabitants.
Oh, why wasn't I there?
Of Jesaja Berlin's birthplace. I think I can confirm that it is indeed on the 4th floor, if you count Latvian style.
Right, it's
in
the
other
5th,
words, counting the ground floor as the 1st floor. I think from memory it was the 4th floor. The apartment is not as big as it was in Jesaja Berlin's day. It certainly didn't have 12 rooms. I think it had about 4 or 5, and the inhabitants explained that it had been occupied by, I think, Soviet officers during the occupation, and at that time the apartment was sort of cut
Subdivided,
in half. Yes. But anyway, I think the sort of subtext for inviting myself and others there this afternoon is that there is a campaign afoot to renovate the facade of the building. Albert Street, as I'm sure many of your audience will know today, is one of the most beautiful streets in Latvia, with some of the finest Art Nouveau architecture, including this building. But it hasn't been renovated as some of the other buildings have. And so there is a campaign to raise money to finance the renovation. So if anybody is interested in that project, please see me afterwards.
So are you saying that the flat was on the top floor? Or the
No,
next
it wasn't on the top floor.
Oh,
it was
so the
next to
penultimate
top
floor.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay,
Yes.
very good. Thank you. I've learnt something.
Thank you. My name is Jānis Vējš. I have translated some Berlin's works into Latvian, and there is a question that puzzles me ever since the first conference that took place some years ago here. That is about the citizenship of Berlin, Berlin's family when he went to England, when they went to England. What I mean, the fact is that I corresponded not with Berlin himself, but with the secretary of the British Academy, Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown, yeah, Peter Brown.
Yeah. And Sir Jesaja was ex-president of the Academy at that time, and Mr. Brown got in contact with him for the permission to translate it into Latvian at the beginning of the 90s. And so he answered, the answer of Mr. Brown to me was that he had spoken to Sir Jesaja, and Sir Jesaja had given his kind permission to translate a small piece of his, I think, of one of his essays. And then he said, he had mentioned that he had been called a Latvian philosopher in, of course it was jokingly, he had been called a Latvian philosopher in a conference in Italy, and so I surmise that it may be after going to England, the family for some time kept their Latvian citizenship, which for otherwise they wouldn't have been able to come from Petrograd to Russia, so they ought to have obtained that. Can you illuminate, please, on that?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, I remember that occasion when in the newspaper Jesaja was described as the greatest living Latvian philosopher, and he was simultaneously touched and amused by this description. But of course, which nationality you possess is a different question from which cultural identity you possess, but nevertheless, you asked about nationality, so I think I can answer that. He was a Russian citizen when born, like his parents, remained a Russian citizen when he moved to Andriapol in 1915 and Petrograd in 1916, and then it was under a treaty with between Latvia and Russia in 1920 that people who had been born or lived under certain conditions in Latvia earlier could transfer their citizenship to Latvia, and I believe that this is what the Berlin family did in 1920 when they came here, and then they moved to England in 1921, still as Latvian citizens, and in 1928 Mendel applied for naturalization in England as British citizen and was successful. So I think the answer to your question is that they were Latvian citizens for 8 years. So he was a Latvian. So the answer I was given this morning, which is that he wasn't a Latvian, is not strictly speaking correct.
Thank you very much for that really interesting talk. My name is Fieda Skultans, and I'm from Riga. And what I wanted to ask was, perhaps you could tell us how representative you think that Jesaja Berlin was of the Jewish community at the time in terms of its non-identification with Latvians, because I think that there's quite a lot of information to suggest that a lot of doctors were Jewish and a lot of dentists were Jewish.
Yes.
And it's virtually impossible to be a medical professional without some degree of identification with the people that you're treating.
I don't honestly know the answer to that question, but my suspicion is that that was managed by having a dual identity, that they preserved their Jewish identity and their membership of the Jewish cultural group, but that they also had another face which enabled them to relate to the non-Jewish people. That would be the obvious way. But I'm sure that, as always, there would be some who identified more, some less. So I think that Jesaja's attitude to non-Jews in Riga is likely to have been more typical than not. That's just a surmise, though.
What was the language you used with his family in Riga? Or what language did they use?
Their language, their letters to him are in Yiddish. At one point, and then they are in English because one of Berlin's aunts, who remained in Riga, called Berta, spoke English. And so what happened was that her father, who was Berlin's grandfather, dictated. He was blind towards the end of his life, and he dictated letters in Yiddish, and she translated them into English and wrote them in English because Berlin didn't read Yiddish at all well, and even Berlin's parents were very poor at Yiddish, so it was thought to be easier for them to have the letters in English. So it's a mixture of Yiddish and English. And he would have written back in English, I'm sure.
Right, Dr. Henrija Hardija, thank you.